The sirens began just after dawn. At first, people thought it was another drill. Israelis are used to the sound. But this time, it wasn't a test. Within minutes, the sky over Tel Aviv lit up with streaks of fire. Iraqi missiles, launched from mobile units deep in Anbar province, had crossed the border and were now raining down on civilian neighborhoods. The Iron Dome intercepted many, but not all. One missile struck a residential tower in Holon. Another hit a gas depot near Ashdod, igniting a fireball that could be seen for miles. Emergency services scrambled, but the scale was overwhelming. By noon, the death toll had already reached into the hundreds. Hospitals were overflowing. Blood banks issued urgent calls. The Israeli Defense Forces retaliated swiftly, targeting launch sites in Iraq and Syria. But the damage was done. The oil terminals in Haifa were ablaze. The Ashkelon refinery, a critical node in Israel's energy infrastructure, was crippled. Fuel shortages began within hours. Long lines formed at gas stations. Public transport was suspended in several cities. The government declared a state of emergency. What made this attack different wasn't just the scale, it was the coordination. Intelligence reports later confirmed that the missiles were part of a joint operation involving Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, Hezbollah units in Lebanon, and drone support from Syria. The goal was clear: paralyze Israel's energy sector and sow chaos among its population. And it worked. The economy ground to a halt. Flights were canceled. Ports shut down. The ripple effects were immediate and global. Oil prices surged. European markets tumbled. Washington and Brussels issued statements of solidarity, but on the ground, Israelis were left to pick up the pieces. In Jerusalem, the mood shifted from shock to fury. Families gathered outside hospitals, clutching photos of loved ones still missing. The government's emergency broadcast system looped updates every hour, but the numbers kept climbing. By the second day, over 7,000 casualties were reported, most of them civilians. The Knesset convened in an emergency session, and Prime Minister Cohen addressed the nation. His voice was steady, but the message was clear. This was not just an attack. It was an act of war. The oil crisis deepened. With Haifa's terminals offline and Ashkelon crippled, Israel's strategic reserves were tapped. But they wouldn't last long. Fuel rationing began immediately. Ambulances and military vehicles were prioritized. Private cars were restricted. The black market surged overnight. A liter of gasoline reached triple its usual price. Power outages rolled across cities. Tel Aviv's skyline went dark. Desalination plants slowed, threatening water supply. The Ministry of Energy warned that if refineries weren't restored within a week, the country would face a full-blown energy collapse. International response was swift but cautious. The United States deployed naval assets to the Mediterranean. France and Germany condemned the attacks, but stopped short of military support. Arab states were divided. Some blamed Israel's recent operations in Syria, others remained silent. The UN Security Council held an emergency meeting, but no resolution passed. Meanwhile, Iraqi militias released footage of their missile launches, celebrating the victory against Zionist aggression. The propaganda war was in full swing. Inside Israel, resilience took root. Volunteers distributed food and fuel. Tech companies repurposed drones for emergency deliveries. Schools reopened in bomb shelters. The people were bruised but not broken. And as the dust settled, one question echoed across the nation. How did this happen so fast? The third day brought silence, but not peace. The missile barrage had stopped, but the damage lingered. Streets were eerily quiet. Families stayed indoors, rationing fuel and food. The Israeli media shifted focus from the immediate destruction to the deeper implications. Analysts warned that the oil crisis wasn't just a temporary disruption, it was a strategic vulnerability exposed. Israel, despite its technological edge, had relied heavily on imported crude and regional pipelines. With Haifa and Ashkelon offline, the country faced a reckoning. In the Negev desert, engineers worked around the clock to reroute energy flows from smaller facilities. Mobile generators were deployed to hospitals and water plants. But the strain was visible. Power grids flickered. Internet outages spread. The tech sector, usually Israel's pride, was paralyzed. Data centers went dark.
International client pooled contract.
The shekel dropped sharply against the dollar. Inflation fears grew. And through it all, the question remained, how did Iraqi militias manage to coordinate such a precise strike? Intelligence leaks suggested that Iran had provided satellite data and targeting algorithms. The missiles used were modified Fateh 110s, capable of bypassing some Iron Dome defenses. Cyber attacks had preceded the physical assault, disabling early warning systems in key zones. It was a hybrid war, digital and kinetic, psychological and economic. And it had worked. Israel's oil infrastructure was bleeding, and the world was watching. Yet amid the chaos, stories of heroism emerged. A firefighter in Haifa rescued 12 people from a burning terminal. A teenage girl in Ashdod used her drone to deliver insulin to stranded neighbors. These moments, broadcast across social media, became symbols of defiance. Israel was wounded, but not defeated. And as the nation braced for what came next, its people began to adapt, not just to survive, but to resist. By the end of the week, the Israeli government had activated full wartime protocols. Reserve units were called up. Fuel was diverted entirely to military and emergency operations. The streets of Tel Aviv, once bustling with electric scooters and cafe chatter, now echoed with the rumble of armored vehicles. Checkpoints dotted major intersections. Drones patrolled the skies. The oil crisis had transformed into a national security emergency. But the crisis wasn't just logistical, it was psychological. For the first time in decades, Israelis felt vulnerable in a way that Iron Dome couldn't shield. The idea that missiles could pierce the heart of the country, that energy lifelines could be severed in minutes, shook the national psyche. News anchors no longer asked if more attacks would come, but when. Supermarkets imposed purchase limits. Pharmacies ran low on basic supplies. The sense of siege was palpable. Meanwhile, the international community scrambled to respond. The U.S. Congress fast-tracked emergency aid. Tankers rerouted to deliver crude to Israeli ports still operational. NATO intelligence teams arrived to assist in tracking further threats. But the geopolitical chessboard was shifting. Iran denied direct involvement, but its fingerprints were everywhere. Russia called for de-escalation, while quietly supplying advanced radar systems to Iraq. China offered mediation, eyeing the region's energy corridors. Inside Israel, the crisis sparked a rare political unity. Opposition leaders stood beside the prime minister in televised briefings. Civil society mobilized. Orthodox communities opened their synagogues as shelters. Arab-Israeli towns sent convoys of aid to Jewish neighbors. The oil crisis, born of destruction, was forging unexpected solidarity. Still, the question loomed. Was this the beginning of a broader war, or the final act of a long-simmering conflict? As night fell on the seventh day, the skies remained quiet, but no one slept easy. 10 days after the first missile struck, Israel stood at a crossroads. The immediate crisis had been contained, fires extinguished, refineries stabilized, and emergency fuel shipments arriving from allies. But the scars remained. Over 7,200 lives lost. Thousands more injured. Entire neighborhoods flattened. The oil crisis had exposed not just a tactical weakness, but a strategic blind spot. And now, the country faced a choice: rebuild as before, or reimagine its future. In a televised address, Prime Minister Cohen announced a sweeping energy reform plan. Israel would accelerate its transition to renewables, decentralize its grid, and invest in domestic oil alternatives. The Tamar and Leviathan gas fields would be fortified. Solar farms in the Negev would be expanded. The message was clear: never again would a single missile threaten national survival. But beyond policy, the cultural shift was profound. Artists painted murals on bombed-out walls. Musicians held concerts in shelters. Survivors shared stories that transcended politics. The tragedy had united Israelis across faiths, backgrounds, and ideologies. Arab-Israeli leaders joined Jewish rabbis in memorial services. The nation mourned together and began to heal. Internationally, the attack reshaped alliances. The Abraham Accords were tested but held. Gulf states, wary of Iran's reach, deepened security ties with Israel. The U.S. pledged long-term energy support. Europe began reevaluating its Middle East strategy. And Iraq, under global pressure, faced internal reckoning over its militias' role. As the sun rose over a battered but defiant land, one truth emerged. Israel had been hit hard, but it had not fallen. The oil crisis was a wake-up call, a tragedy, and a turning point. And in its aftermath, the country found not just resilience, but resolve. The road ahead would be long, but it would be walked together.